I want to be honest about something before I start. I didn't like her at first. That's important to say because everyone who tells you about Katara now, they talk about her like she stepped off some ancient mythology painting, like she arrived fully formed with her jaw set and her eyes already glowing with purpose. They make her sound like she was always going to be what she became. She wasn't. She was just a person. A loud, stubborn, occasionally infuriating person who had a habit of eating lunch at the wrong table and arguing with superior officers in front of enlisted men, which is the kind of thing that gets you reassigned 3 times in 2 years, which is exactly what happened to her before she ended up at Dunn Station. I was already there when she arrived. I'd been at Dunn Station for 8 months by then, long enough to know every smell in that place, the metallic bite of the ventilation recyclers, the warm animal musk that came from the wreck enclosures on the eastern wing, the particular combination of synthetic protein and overcooked grain that the commissary called morning meal. I knew which corridors vibrated when the ion engines in Bay 4 cycled up. I knew which lights flickered before a storm system rolled in from the gas belt. I knew the sound the wreck cubs made when they were hungry, which was somewhere between a high-pitched mechanical whine and something your body mistook for a proximity alarm. I knew all of that. I was comfortable with all of that. Then Corporal Katara Moslin showed up with 2 duffel bags, a cracked visor clipped to her belt, and a look on her face like she'd been told a joke she didn't find funny. She stood in the assignment bay looking at her station orders, and I watched her read them twice. Then she looked up at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she looked back down. Then she said, to nobody in particular, "They put me on cub watch." Of course they did. The officer processing her intake didn't look up from his screen. "Correct. Eastern Wing. Predator Enclosure Support Duty. You'll receive full orientation." "I've read the briefing," she said. "I just want to note, for the record, that I applied for sensor array calibration work." "Noted." "And that I have a commendation in technical systems from the Callum Academy." "Also noted." "And that putting a technical systems specialist on animal-adjacent care duty is a waste of." "Corporal," the officer finally looked up. He had the particular expression that men develop after years of processing reassignments from personnel departments that don't listen to them either, a kind of shared exhaustion. "The wreck cubs in Eastern Wing are not animals. They are the biological offspring of our primary treaty partner species, and their welfare is considered a Tier 1 security matter under Coalition Accord Section 14. The technical designation of your duty is Liaison Adjacent Enclosure Support, and it carries a security clearance you would not otherwise hold for at least 3 more years of service. So." She stared at him. He stared back. "Right," she said finally. "Where's the Eastern Wing?" I watched her walk toward it. I don't know why I followed. I was off duty. I had nothing to do with Eastern Wing operations, and I had a plate of food getting cold in the commissary. But something about the way she held herself, tight-shouldered, jaw working slightly, like she was having a conversation with herself she hadn't finished yet, made me curious. I followed her to the Eastern Wing access corridor and stopped at the viewing port. Through the reinforced transparency panel, I could see the wreck enclosure, a vast pressurized chamber that the station engineers had spent 4 months retrofitting with the right soil substrates, atmospheric density, and UV simulation, arrays to approximate the predator homeworld conditions well enough for developing cubs. The adult wreck, the parents, the hunting parties, the patriarchs, they were out on operation. That was normal. The cubs were left in rotating coalition care during extended operations, because transporting them in military configurations was considered too risky. The cubs, let me describe them, because most people who weren't at Dunn Station have only seen the photographs, and photographs don't really capture it. There were 7 of them. Their ages ranged from what the wreck themselves described as 3rd moon cycle to 7th moon cycle, which translated approximately to 6 months and 18 months in human developmental terms. They were big. Even the smallest one, a female the others seemed to defer to in some way I never fully understood, was the size of a large earth wolf. The eldest was the size of a draft horse. They were built like nothing in the human animal catalog. Their spines were armored, not the soft keratin plates of something like an armadillo, but genuine articulated bone plates that could flatten for movement or raise into serrated ridges when they were alarmed. Their lower jaw unhinged slightly when they yawned or called. I'd seen a grown human take 3 steps backward the first time they witnessed it, instinct overriding reason. Their front limbs were wrong in a way that took time to get used to. Too long, jointed in 3 places, with the third joint going in the direction you didn't expect. They moved with a liquid quality that made your eyes have trouble tracking them even in a calm, well-lit room. And they were children. That was the thing you had to keep reminding yourself. Children who played, who fought over the best sleeping spots, who howled when they were hungry in a frequency that set your teeth on edge, and then, when they were fed, made a low repetitive rumble that was somehow the closest thing to comfort you ever felt at that station. Katara walked into the enclosure access chamber, accepted the briefing tablet from the attendant on duty, and stood at the interior gate looking at them. One of the cubs, I learned later his designation was Vethkar, the one with the asymmetric spine plates, walked directly up to the gate and looked at her. It happened sometimes. Cubs were curious. Staff were instructed not to make direct eye contact during the initial introduction period, to keep a neutral posture, to let the cubs approach or retreat on their own timeline. She looked right back at him. The attendant on duty made a sound like he was about to say something. She glanced at him briefly and held up one finger. He stopped. Vethkar put his nose against the gate. The gate was reinforced polymer with a titanium lattice core, rated for 17,000 psi of direct impact. He was a cub. He couldn't breach it, but he pressed his nose against it and made a very small sound that nobody in the research files had ever managed to accurately transcribe. The closest approximation one researcher had managed was a question shaped like a rumble. Katara Moslin said quietly, "Yeah, me too, actually." Then she went inside. I went back to my commissary plate. My food was cold. I thought about her for the rest of the evening and couldn't fully explain why. Secondary testimony, Station Attendant Priya Yuan. You want to know what she was actually like, not what she became, not the story, what she was actually like day to day in that enclosure with those cubs. I can tell you, I was there every shift she was. She was a problem. That's what I'd have said in the first 2 weeks. The duty protocols for predator cub enclosures were developed by a joint committee, coalition scientists, VREC behavioral experts, human xenobiological specialists, and they represented thousands of hours of careful study. There were good reasons for every rule. She broke approximately half of them within the first week. Not the safety rules. Those she followed with a precision that actually surprised me, given how she handled everything else. The safety parameters, distance protocols during feeding, the alert codes, the emergency seal procedures. She ran those with 0 deviation, which I later learned was because she'd memorized the entire protocol document in her first 2 days. She'd read it cover to cover and then read it again, and then ask me to walk her through the portions she thought the document wasn't clear on. But the behavioral protocols, the ones about interaction posture, about limiting vocalization in the enclosure, about maintaining appropriate emotional distance, those she treated as suggestions. Day 3, I found her sitting on the enclosure floor with the smallest cub, the female one, asleep against her legs. Full contact, against protocol. "That's not allowed," I said. "She was distressed," Katara said. She didn't look up. Her hand was resting lightly on the cub's spine plates, which were fully flat, the full relaxation position. She'd been making that high cycling sound for 40 minutes. Nothing else worked. There are approved de-escalation procedures. I tried them, they didn't work. She looked up then. This worked. Do you want me to move her? I looked at the cub, fully relaxed, breathing in the long, slow rhythm that the behavioral files described as deep rest state, which the VREC researchers had noted was rarely achieved in enclosure conditions and was considered a positive health indicator. No, I said. I filed a behavioral note and didn't record the protocol deviation. That's how it started. That's how it always started with her. By the end of the first month, she had names for all 7 of them. Not the alphanumeric designations in the system, actual names. She developed them from observation of the cub's individual behaviors and had cross-referenced them with what she could find in the available VREC lexicon files to make sure they weren't accidentally insulting. Veth Kar she called Kar, because he already had his designation and it suited him. The small female she called Sen, from a VREC root word that meant approximately the one who watches first. The eldest and largest cub, massive even by VREC standards, nearly 2 meters at the shoulder already, she called Dun, which was simply the VREC word for the color of deep stone, because that's exactly the color his spine plates were. The others she called Rill, Moth, 7, and Patches. 7, because the 7th spine plate on his left side was differently colored. Patches because he had irregular pigmentation across his flank that the research files had flagged as worth monitoring, but which turned out to be perfectly harmless and also, Katara had pointed out, looked exactly like a topographic map of the Callum Basin back on Earth, if you tilted your head and squinted. The VREC behavioral experts reviewed her naming notes and, after a prolonged consultation, officially registered 3 of the names in the coalition records. The others they adapted into VREC phonetics. It was the first time in recorded human-VREC relations that a human had named VREC cubs in a way that the VREC themselves, upon learning of it, did not object to. She talked to them. I know that sounds obvious, everyone talked to the cubs to some degree, but she talked to them the way you talk to someone you expect to understand you eventually. Not explaining, not narrating her actions like the behavioral protocol suggested. Now I am approaching your feeding station, please remain calm. That kind of clinical running commentary. She just talked. She told them about Earth. She described weather, real weather, rain and thunder, and the particular quality of light just before a storm, which she said was her favorite thing. She described food, real food, not the commissary approximation, and she described it with such specific nostalgic detail that I caught myself standing in the access corridor, listening to her explain the exact way her grandmother's particular bread smelled when it was still warm, because it was the most human thing I'd heard anyone say in months. She argued with them. She'd tell Carr that he was not, in fact, the dominant figure in this enclosure, and that if he knocked the feeding station over one more time she was going to have to report him, and Carr would look at her with his enormous pale eyes and make the sound that the behavioral files cataloged as not interested dismissal. And she'd say, "Yeah, that's what I thought, you enormous drama," and he'd come back 20 minutes later and press his head against the side of her knee. Which was what he always did when he wanted contact but didn't want to ask for it directly. She read to them. Toward the end, the last few months, she was reading to them from an old paper book she'd had with her since the academy. Old Earth stories, human mythology, folklore, hero stories. I only heard fragments from outside the access corridor, but I remember one evening she was reading something about a woman who walked into a dark forest to find her brother, and her voice went very quiet when she read it, and I stood very still, and all 7 of the cubs were lying in a loose semicircle around her, which they never did for anyone else. What follows is the threat assessment as understood in the weeks before the events. Dunn Station occupied a position that was strategically valuable for reasons that required 3 separate security briefings to fully explain, which is the intelligence community's way of saying, extremely contested. It sat at the intersection of three coalition transit lanes and served as the primary resupply and communications node for 6 active wreck hunting operations in the outer belt. This made it a target. The Keth Dominion, a coalition of species that had been conducting a slow, systematic pressure campaign against human wreck alliance stability for 11 years, had made it known through various back-channel communications that they considered the alliance unnatural and that destabilizing it served their long-term territorial interests. Coalition intelligence had been tracking a specific Keth operational cell for 7 months. The cell's method of operation was consistent. They did not strike military targets directly. They struck leverage points. The wreck cubs at Dunn Station were, in the plainest possible terms, the most significant leverage point in the sector. In wreck culture, the young of a clan are not simply children. They are the continuation of the clan's identity in a way that has no precise human equivalent. The closest approximation researchers have offered is, imagine if every child a community raised was also that community's only library, the only place every story, every practice, every way of being in the world was stored. The destruction of wreck cubs was not merely tragedy. In wreck understanding, it was erasure. It was the ending of everything the parents of those cubs had ever been. The wreck hunting operations that kept Dunn Station secure relied on those cubs being safe. The moment that safety was meaningfully threatened, every wreck warrior in 6 active operations would abandon their positions to respond. 6 operations would collapse. The transit lanes would become contested, and the Keth Dominion would have what they'd been building toward for 11 years, a crack in the alliance that they could lever open. Intelligence Command understood this. The Dunn Station Garrison Commander understood this. The threat was real, assessed at moderate to high probability, and the response protocols were in place. What Intelligence Command did not fully account for was the operational timeline. The attack came 14 days earlier than the probability models suggested. Personal log, Corporal Jerk Osula continued. Entry time stamp, Station Standard Day 247. I remember the exact moment I knew something was wrong, and it was before the alarms. It was the smell. I know that sounds like the kind of thing you say afterward to make yourself sound more perceptive than you were, but I have been trying very hard in these logs to tell the truth about everything, so it was the smell. Something chemical and sharp that didn't belong in the recycled station air. Something underneath the normal engine and synthetic protein combination. Something that made my throat prickle slightly and made me think, before I knew what I was thinking, that is not a station smell. I was in the transit corridor between the commissary and the eastern wing. I was bringing Katara her dinner because she'd been in the enclosure since her shift started and hadn't come out, and I'd learned by then that if I didn't bring food to her, she simply didn't eat, which was a thing I'd mentioned to her multiple times, and which she always agreed was a bad habit, and then continued doing. I smelled that smell. And then the lights went out. Not a normal power fluctuation. The station had a 3-tier backup system. What the lights going out meant was that 3 tiers of power management had failed simultaneously, which required either a catastrophic systems failure, which would have triggered a very different set of alarms, or deliberate sabotage of all 3 systems in coordinated sequence. The emergency bioluminescent strips activated, pale blue-green, enough to see by if you stood still and let your eyes adjust, not enough to feel safe. The alarm started 42 seconds after the lights went out. I know the exact count because I was counting. I ran for the eastern wing. Witness account, Senior Technician Almara Vesh. We lost external comms first. That's the signature of a Keth Dominion signal lock. They don't jam you, they redirect you. So the system keeps reporting normal function while everything you transmit goes into a null loop. It took us 11 minutes to diagnose the redirect. which means for 11 minutes we believed we were transmitting distress calls that were going nowhere. By the time we had a real signal out, we had already lost the South Access Corridor. There were 22 of them. Keth assault operatives, wearing Dunn station maintenance coveralls over their tactical gear. The coveralls were good enough that the automated recognition systems didn't flag them until they were already through the secondary security checkpoint. We don't fully understand how they got the coveralls. Coalition intelligence has theories. I am not cleared to discuss the theories. Their target was the Eastern Wing. Every analyst who reviewed the operation afterward confirmed the Cubs were the objective. Not killing them, the Keth Dominion is systematic, not chaotic. They wanted to take them, remove them from the station. With 7 Vrek Cubs in Keth custody, the leverage was almost incalculably large. The Vrek would not simply abandon their coalition operations. They would burn the entire transit sector looking for their young. The garrison response was 15 armed personnel. In a full-power scenario, that's more than sufficient to hold the Eastern Wing access points. In an emergency lighting, compromised communication scenario, it was a very different calculation. Sergeant Delian, who commanded the garrison response, made a triage decision. He held the south and west corridors, which were the most direct access routes, and accepted that the east-north approach corridor, longer, less direct, but still navigable, was underguarded. The Keth operatives were not taking the direct route. They had planned for the garrison response. They were already in the east-north approach corridor when Sergeant Delian's team took their positions at south and west. One person was standing between the east-north approach corridor and the Cubs. Personal log, Corporal Jerk Osula continued. Entry time stamp. Station Standard Day 247, continued. I reached the Eastern Wing access in the blue-green emergency light, and the door was sealed from the inside. There was a manual lock on enclosure access doors, a physical bolt, redundant with the electronic systems, installed precisely because electronic systems can be compromised. The physical bolt could only be operated from inside the room. She had thrown it from inside. I pressed my face against the small observation panel. The bioluminescent strips in the corridor gave just enough light to see by. Inside the enclosure access room, there was no strip lighting. The system was different in there, designed not to alarm the Cubs. It was darker, but I could see the shape of the internal gate, and I could see her. She was standing at the internal gate with her back to the Cubs. All 7 of them were pressed against the far wall of the enclosure. Dunn and Carr were at the front of the group, the 2 largest, positioning themselves at the edge. Sen and the younger ones were behind them. The spine plates on all 7 were raised and rigid. Katara had her sidearm out, standard coalition issue. She was standing in a wide stance, weight slightly forward, arms steady. She was looking at the east-north access point. She knew they were coming from that direction. I don't know how she knew. The alarm systems were fragmented. The communications were down, but she knew. Maybe she heard something. Maybe she smelled what I had smelled and understood it faster than I did. I hammered on the observation panel. She glanced at me, just a glance, a single brief sideways look, and held up the same single finger she'd held up the first time I tried to give her guidance she didn't want. Then she looked back at the east-north access point. The east-north corridor terminates at a doorway approximately 94 centimeters wide. Standard station construction. The door itself was a standard pressure-rated access door, not rated for security against assault. There were no reinforced access doors in that corridor because, in the original station design, that corridor was not a primary security concern. This is the doorway she chose to hold. I have been asked, by multiple members of this inquiry board, to comment on the tactical logic of her decision. I want to be precise about this. I am a medical officer. I will describe what the physical evidence tells us. The tactical evaluation is not mine to give. what the physical evidence tells us. She chose the narrowest point in the east-north approach, not the doorway to the enclosure access room itself, but the one before it, approximately 20 meters back, which forced any approaching force to come in single-file configuration. This is tactically coherent, a choke point, a way of equalizing the numerical disadvantage. She had positioned herself behind a service conduit housing that gave her partial cover from the east, while leaving her a clear line of sight down the corridor. She had broken 2 of the bioluminescent lighting strips in her section of corridor. Not all of them, she'd left 2, placed to give her backlight advantage over anyone approaching from the east. They would be lit. She would be in relative shadow. She had also somehow, in what must have been a very short window of time, set 2 improvised pressure alerts in the corridor. Not weapons, not explosive. Pressure alerts, a simple system that triggered a high-frequency chirp when weight was placed on them. They were made from components of a maintenance diagnostic kit. They would give her 2 seconds of warning before someone came around the corridor bend. I found all of this in the physical evidence survey. I found no evidence of panic, no evidence of rushed or disorganized decision-making. Every choice was deliberate. She was not trained for this. Her service record shows standard combat qualification, no special operations background, no advanced tactical certification. She was a corporal with a technical systems commendation and a history of reassignments. Everything she did in that corridor, she figured out herself in the dark alone, in the time it took me to write this paragraph. Reconstructed account, based on physical evidence, station sensor fragments, and post-action testimony of Keth survivors. Note, 3 Keth operatives survived the incident and were taken into coalition custody. Their testimony, translated and cross-referenced with physical evidence, forms the basis of this reconstruction. The Keth survivors requested that this account be accurate. The first operative to round the bend in the east-north corridor was a Keth unit designated in their internal records as Strike 4. He was experienced. He had conducted 12 previous Keth Dominion extraction operations. He heard the pressure alert chirp. He had approximately 1.5 seconds to process that sound before the shot. Katara Moslin hit him with the first shot. 1 shot, he went down. The operative behind him pulled back around the bend and the column reorganized. They had expected resistance, but they had expected it to be staged at the enclosure access room, not 20 meters back. This told them someone had thought about this. That changed the calculation. They sent 2 operatives simultaneously, using the far wall for partial cover. She hit one. The other made it to the service conduit housing. There was a close-quarters engagement behind the service conduit housing. The physical evidence is consistent with what the surviving operative described. She was fast, faster than he expected from a human. She used the conduit housing itself as leverage. She understood the physical space in a way that suggested she'd spent those first minutes memorizing it rather than simply finding a position. She sustained 2 injuries in the close-quarters engagement, a deep laceration to the left forearm and a blunt force injury to the right shoulder that the medical evidence suggests came from the conduit housing itself rather than the operative. She went into it hard, using her own body to break his grip. The operative was neutralized. She returned to her position. By this point, approximately 6 minutes had elapsed since the lights went out. The remaining operatives tried 3 more approaches over the next 22 minutes. Each time, she held the corridor. Each time, she took more damage. The laceration on her left forearm was significant. She had no medical supplies, and she improvised a pressure wrap from a piece of her jacket lining, which slowed the bleeding enough to keep her functional. The surviving operatives were asked, afterward, why they did not simply overwhelm the position with numbers. Their answers were remarkably consistent across 3 separate interrogations. We kept expecting her to retreat. Every time we pressed, We expected her to fall back to the enclosure door and make her stand there. She never retreated. She stayed at the choke point. Every time we tried to push through, she was still there. One of them added, unprompted, "We have encountered many human military personnel in our operations. I want to say this accurately. She was not what we expected a human to be." The inquiry board asked him to clarify what he meant. He said, "We expected her to be afraid. We expected her to be making calculations about survival. She was not calculating survival. She had already made a different calculation. I do not have the right word for it in your language. We have a word for it in ours. It translates approximately as, the one who has already decided the cost." Personal log, Corporal Jerk Osula continued. Entry time stamp. Station Standard Day 247, continued. I don't know exactly what was happening in that corridor. I was on the wrong side of a locked door, and the observation panel showed me nothing past the internal gate. What I know is the sounds. The sounds through the door were fragmented and muffled and wrong in their sequence. Nothing happened in the order you expected it to. There were sounds I recognized from weapons training and sounds I didn't recognize, and there were long silences that were worse than the sounds. And through all of it, from inside the enclosure, the cubs, Dunn and Carr, had never stopped pressing toward the internal gate. Every time there was a loud sound from the corridor, Dunn made a sound I cannot describe with any accuracy. It went through the walls of the access room and the reinforced door, and whatever distance separated us, and landed somewhere in the middle of my chest and sat there. Carr paced, side to side. His spine plates were fully raised. I'd seen the behavioral files describe that as pre-hunt configuration. He was 6 months past his developmental threshold. He wasn't old enough to hunt. He was trying to. Sen had moved from the back of the group to a position just behind Dunn. She was doing the thing she always did when she was trying to understand something, head cocked to one side, auditory pits fully open, processing every sound frequency the room gave her. They knew. I don't know what they understood about what was happening, but they knew that she was out there, and that she was between them and whatever was coming. I have spent a lot of time since that day thinking about the gap between what they could understand and what they somehow knew anyway. Interviewed, Coalition Inquiry Board, Day 4. We cleared the South Corridor at minute 19 and started pushing toward East-North at minute 21. We didn't know she was there. Our communications were still partially fragmented, and the garrison personnel accounting showed her on roster in the Eastern Wing, which we assumed meant she was inside the secured enclosure, not outside it. I want to be precise about the timeline because it matters. We reached the East-North Corridor junction at minute 26. We heard weapons fire. We understood immediately that someone was engaging at the choke point ahead of us. We moved up. What we found at minute 28. She was still standing. I need to be accurate, she was not standing the way she had been. She was braced against the service conduit housing. Her left arm was held close to her side. The improvised pressure wrap was soaked through. Her right side the shoulder injury was visually significant. The medic's report covers the specifics. What I can tell you is what I saw with my eyes. She was still facing down the corridor. She had not turned around. She had not moved back toward the enclosure door. There were 4 Keth operatives still functional at the far end of the corridor. They saw us come around the junction. They stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. Then she straightened up from the conduit housing and she looked at me and she said, in the most even voice I have ever heard from anyone in combat conditions, "Sergeant, East-North is clear to the bend. 4 remaining at the bend. 2 are dealing with something. I think one of them may have a signal device. They've been trying to get something to work for the last few minutes." She said it like she was giving a maintenance status update, like she was telling me which recycler unit was performing below threshold. I said, "Corporal, are you?" She said, "I'm functional. Do you want the corridor assessment or not?" I took the corridor assessment. We moved up. The remaining 4 Keth operatives did not engage. They attempted to withdraw, which suggested their operation parameters included an extraction protocol in the event of mission failure, which means they had, on some level, assessed the mission as failed. We apprehended 3 of them. The 4th reached a shuttle access point. He did not get the shuttle off the dock. Bay control had regained power by then. I turned around at the end of the corridor push, and she wasn't where I'd left her. She had walked back down the east-north corridor, and she was standing at the enclosure access door, and she was doing something with the physical bolt mechanism. Her left arm was barely functional. She was doing it one-handed. She got the door open. She walked inside. Personal log, Corporal Jerk Osula continued. Entry time stamp. Station Standard Day 247, continued. I heard the bolt release. I heard the door open. I was still in the outer access corridor, useless, having spent the last 28 minutes on the wrong side of a door. I pressed against the observation panel. She walked through the internal gate into the enclosure. She walked in the way she always walked in, not rushing, not flinching from the size of them, just walking in like she belonged there, which she did, which she had from the first day, and she sat down on the enclosure floor. Carr reached her first. He moved faster than anything that size should be able to move. He put his enormous head against her uninjured shoulder and made the sound, that particular sound that had no transcription in the behavioral files, that question-shaped rumble, and she put her hand on his spine plates, and they were fully flat. Dunn came next, then Sen. Then the others, one by one, closing around her, pressing in close, the largest ones at the outside, the younger ones finding the interior spaces between the larger bodies, and she was at the center of all of them, and she was speaking to them very quietly, and I could not hear what she said. I could see, through the panel, that she was trying to keep her injured left arm out of contact with any of them, protecting them from the blood, protecting herself from the pressure, being careful even now, even sitting on the floor of a darkened enclosure in the aftermath of whatever that corridor had asked of her. The medics arrived 30 seconds later. She argued with them for 45 seconds about whether she needed to leave the enclosure for treatment. The lead medic, a woman with 9 years of field experience who had patched up soldiers in 3 active conflict zones, looked at the 7 Vrek predator cubs closing protectively around a human corporal, and made a judgment call that is not in any protocol document. She treated Katara inside the enclosure. The patriarch of the Vrek hunting force received notification through the Coalition diplomatic channel at 04, 17 Station Standard, 17 hours after the incident. The notification package included incident summary, tactical assessment, medical reports on all 7 cubs, no injuries sustained, no psychological trauma indicators beyond baseline elevated alertness, resolved within 6 hours, and the personnel report on the Coalition soldier who held the corridor. The Patriarch's response came 41 minutes later. Standard Vrek response to a diplomatic notification of this nature, even one with positive resolution, was anywhere from 6 to 14 hours, because the Vrek response protocol involved consultation across the full hunting party hierarchy before any official communication was issued. 41 minutes. The response was 11 words in Vrek Standard, which translates with some approximation as, "Name this human to us, we would know her name." Coalition Protocol for Diplomatic Name Sharing was an 8-page document. The liaison on duty read the first paragraph, determined that the spirit of the protocol was clearly satisfied, and transmitted Katara Moslin's full name, rank, homeworld designation, and service record within the hour. The Patriarch's acknowledgement came back in 3 words. "We hear her." In Vrek culture, "we hear her" is not a phrase of passive reception. It is a phrase of active incorporation. The VREC linguistic researchers in the Coalition archive have a long footnote on this phrase. The short version is, it is what the VREC say when something becomes part of how they understand the world. Personal log, Corporal Jerk Osula continued. Entry time stamp. Station standard day 261, recovery period. Katara was in the medical bay for 9 days. I visited every day. On the 3rd day she told me I didn't have to, and on the 4th day I didn't go, and she was irritated about it when I came on the 5th day. So after that I just went every day, and we didn't discuss whether I had to. She asked about the cubs on the 1st day, before she asked about her shoulder, before she asked about the mission debrief, before she asked literally anything else. The medic told her they were fine and she closed her eyes and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, what about the shoulder?" The shoulder was bad. Not mission ending, but bad. There was a period of 2 days where the discussions were about nerve damage and long-term mobility and what that might mean for continued service. She listened to all of it very carefully and asked good questions, and then, on the evening of the 2nd day, she said to me when the medics had stepped out, "I'm not leaving Dunn Station. Just so you know." I said, "You might not have a choice." She said, "I'll talk to the assignment officers." I said, "You've talked to assignment officers before." She said, "I was less motivated before." She was right. She stayed. She went back to Eastern Wing on day 261, which was the day the medical officer cleared her for light duty. Her left arm worked. Her shoulder worked. There would be pain long-term that she managed with the particular combination of not mentioning it and occasional sharp intake of breath that I came to know very well over the following months. The cubs responded to her return in a way that the behavioral researchers filed a 7-page report about, because nothing in the observed behavioral literature for VREC cubs covered what they did. They did not simply resume normal enclosure behavior. Each of them, separately, at different times over the first 3 days, went through what the researchers described as an extended proximity ritual, remaining in close contact with her for durations significantly longer than any previously recorded cub-to-human contact at the station. Dunn would not move more than 4 meters from her for the first 2 days. Carr pressed his head against her injury site, gently, with a pressure so precisely calibrated it was almost impossible to believe it was an instinct and not a decision, and made a very low sustained hum that one researcher noted, in the margin of the official report, looked like what my grandmother would have called keeping watch. Sen watched her. Not the way she always watched everything, the behavioral observation, the head tilt and the open auditory pits, just watched her, with stillness. I asked Katara about it once, what she thought they were doing. She thought about it for a while. She was feeding Patches. He was always hungry, always. It was a running theme, and she didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I think they're making sure I'm real, that I came back." She paused. "I think they understand more than the reports say." The hunting party returned to Dunn Station 43 days after the incident. This was not scheduled. The operation was ongoing. The return of the full Patriarch-led hunting force to a transit station in the middle of an active operation was, in the history of human VREC coalition operations, unprecedented. They did not transmit advance notification. They arrived. 17 warships in close formation, which activated every automated defense protocol on the station before Commander Vash personally overrode them, because the alternative was an incident of a very different kind. The Patriarch requested, through his liaison, a meeting, not with Coalition Command, not with the garrison commander, with Corporal Katara Moslin. Commander Vash relayed the request to her in person, because he didn't entirely trust any secondary communication system not to lose something in translation, and he wanted to see her face when he told her. Her face, according to Commander Vash's personal note appended to the log, was not particularly different from her normal face, which is the face of someone who has decided something and is waiting for the rest of the situation to catch up. She said, "When?" Vash said, "They're already docked." She said, "Okay, let me wash my hands, I've been in the enclosure." Coalition Diplomatic Record. The meeting was held in the Eastern Wing's secondary observation chamber, a room with large transparency panels overlooking the main enclosure. It had been chosen by the Vrek liaison at the Patriarch's request, and nobody had questioned the choice until the Patriarch and his party arrived, and everyone realized simultaneously that the Patriarch had chosen to conduct this meeting in a room where he could see his cubs. There were 7 Vrek warriors in the Patriarch's party. Patriarch Grunveth himself was. The witnesses struggled with this in their descriptions, not because they lacked vocabulary, but because it is genuinely difficult to describe a being that causes every ambient sound in the room to feel quieter without making a sound itself. He was very old, by Vrek reckoning. His spine plates were the color of old volcanic rock, and the pattern of scarring along his flanks represented a history that the Vrek researchers estimated covered 6 decades of operations. Katara walked in with Commander Vash and the Coalition diplomatic liaison and 2 security officers who, everyone in the room privately understood, were there for procedural reasons only. She walked across the room and she stood in front of the Patriarch. He was nearly 3 times her height. His spine plates were raised, not the full combat configuration raise, but a partial, formal elevation that the Vrek behavioral researchers in their notes described as the posture of significant occasion. He looked at her for a very long time. Then he looked at the transparency panel, at the enclosure, at Carr and Dunn and Sin and the others, who had, without any instruction from anyone, positioned themselves at the transparency panel and were looking back. Grunveth made a sound, a single sustained vocalization that the acoustic recording equipment, which was at least functioning, captured, and which the Vrek researchers subsequently spent 4 months analyzing. The closest translation they arrived at, and they noted this was approximate and probably insufficient. "You are the one who stayed." Katara said, "The witnesses are consistent on this. They're good kids." The Vrek liaison froze. The Coalition diplomatic liaison froze. Commander Vash later described this moment as the longest 3 seconds of my career. Patriarch Grunveth made a sound that nobody had ever heard a Vrek Patriarch make in the presence of a human before. He was laughing. It was not a human laugh. It was large and layered and came from somewhere deep in his chest and resonated differently than the rest of his vocalizations. But every human in the room, without exception, understood immediately what they were hearing. 3 of the 7 warriors in his party made a similar sound, smaller, controlled. The Patriarch then did something that was not in any protocol document, not in any behavioral study, not in any diplomatic brief. He lowered his head. Not a bow in the human sense. A slow, deliberate lowering of the entire skull. And when he did it, his spine plates flattened, which meant that the gesture exposed the back of his neck, which in Vrek body language was the physical position associated with the acknowledgement of something larger than the self. The Vrek liaison's voice, later describing this moment, was barely steady. The Patriarch does not lower his head, not to coalition commanders, not to treaty partners. In 60 years of recorded human-Vrek contact, this has not happened. Personal log, Corporal Jerk Osula continued. Entry time stamp, Station Standard Day 302. She didn't tell me what happened in the room. I heard it from Vash eventually and from the liaison, and I pieced it together. She didn't tell me because she wasn't keeping it secret. She just didn't have the habit of narrating her own significant moments. I don't think she ever fully accepted that the moments were significant. She just thought she'd done what needed to be done. What she told me was this. After the formal meeting, the patriarch had asked, through his liaison, to take her into the enclosure with the cubs. Not unusual, on its own, Vrek parents occasionally spent time in the enclosure during visits. What was unusual was that he asked specifically to do it with her present. She said they were in there for 2 hours. She said it was quiet. The patriarch was not like the other adult Vrek she'd seen, not the size of presence you'd expect given the visual impact of him. He moved through the enclosure slowly, and the cubs responded to him the way she'd seen children respond to an elder who was also entirely trustworthy, with the ease of certainty. She said he spent a long time with each of them separately, running his great scarred head along their flanks, making very low sounds, learning what they'd become in his absence. At some point, she said, Carr had done the thing pressed against her knee, that sidelong request for contact he'd never fully learned to just ask for directly, and Groenveth had watched this and been still for a long time. Then the patriarch had said something in Vrek standard, and his liaison had translated. He says, "You taught him that there are things worth coming back to. He says this is what our young need to know. He says you gave it to him when we could not." She'd said something back. She didn't tell me what. She said it wasn't important. I know her well enough to know it was important and that she thought she shouldn't say it, so she didn't. Katara Moslin served at Dun Station for another 3 years, before accepting a reassignment to the Coalition's newly formed Predator Liaison Division. A division that was created in part because the incident at Dun Station had made very clear that the existing frameworks for human-Vrek operational cooperation were insufficient. She did not accept the promotion that came with the division appointment until the second time it was offered. On the first occasion, she submitted a written note to personnel that said, essentially, "I am not sure I am the right person for this." Personnel submitted the promotion a second time with a handwritten note attached that said, "We are sure enough for both of us." She accepted the second time. The cubs were returned to their families when they reached the appropriate developmental threshold. The eldest 3 first, then the remaining 4 over a period of 14 months. Each departure from Dun Station was, by Katara's personal request, handled in the early morning hours, with minimal staff present, because she had determined through 3 years of observation that the cubs found large group human presence during emotionally significant moments uncomfortable, and she intended to make every leaving as easy as possible. She was present for each one. Corporal Osula, who had also remained at Dun Station, accompanied her for 3 of them and described the same thing each time. She stood at the enclosure gate, and they came to her before they left, each one, and she said something to each of them that he did not hear and probably was not meant to hear, and then they went. The last one to leave was Sen, the one who had always watched. The one who had pressed against Katara's legs in the first week and slept, which had started all of it. Osula said, "Katara stood at the gate for a long time after. I didn't say anything. After a while she said, 'She'll be okay,' just that. 'She'll be okay.' And then she went to the commissary and ate a full meal, which was unusual for her, and she seemed completely fine." He paused in the interview. "I think she needed someone to say it. That Sen would be okay. I think she'd been not saying it for months just to avoid jinxing it, so she said it when it was done, when it was true." This is not a rule they speak aloud. It is one of those cultural facts that is so fundamental it has never needed to be said. The naming of a Vrek blade is a ceremony of lineage, of what the blade has seen, of what it will be asked to do. A blade carries a name that anchors it to the past and to the future simultaneously. To name a blade after a living person would imply certainty about what that person's story would become. And the Vrek are, in all things, deeply respectful of stories that aren't finished. They named their blades after Katara Moslin while she was still alive. Not all of them. The Vrek community is large and the coalition hunting parties are many and practices vary. But the Vrek who had been on operations during the Dun Station incident a Patriarch Grunveth's hunting force, 17 ships, hundreds of warriors. Those Vrek began the practice. The Vrek word they used was Cater. It is not exactly her name. It is her name processed through Vrek phonetics in a specific way that, in Vrek linguistic tradition, transforms a proper noun into a quality. Not Catera as an identifier. Cater as a thing a blade could be. The Vrek researchers, asked to translate it, argued about it for several months and produced a paper with 17 pages of footnotes. The practical summary. Cater, the quality of standing when there is no calculation that supports standing. Not bravery. Bravery implies the overcoming of fear. Cater is the state of having already resolved the question of cost, so that the action itself is simply the execution of a decision already made. Cater is what you are when you have already chosen completely what matters more than yourself. Every blade in Grunveth's hunting force carries the inscription, a small symbol etched into the back of the blade where the grip meets the flat, where the warrior's hand rests when the weapon is sheathed. The symbol is not a word. It is a mark, a single curving line that the Vrek describe as the posture of standing at the last door. Personal log, Corporal Jerk Osula continued. Final entry, Station Standard Day 1104. I was transferred out of Dunn Station eventually. Different posting, different work, none of which is relevant here. I've continued these logs because I started them, and I find it hard to stop things I've started. Catera and I stayed in contact. She is better at communicating than you'd expect from someone who never asked for any of this. She's terrible with formal correspondence but very good with short transmissions. 3 or 4 sentences, very occasional, always at unexpected hours, always containing exactly as much as needs to be said and nothing more. She sent me a transmission when she heard they were compiling this archive. She said, "Make sure they get the cubs right, not what they looked like, what they were like." I told her I'd tell them what I knew. She said, "Tell them Carr was a drama. Tell them Sen figured everything out before anyone else. Tell them Dunn was the gentlest one, which sounds wrong given the size, but it was true. Tell them Patches had that map on his side, and nobody knew what to make of it." I said I'd tell them all of it. She said, "Also tell them I really did not want to be on Cub Watch. I want that on the record." I told her it would be on the record. I'm putting it on the record now. What I actually want to end with is something smaller. Something from much earlier, before any of it happened, before the corridor and the door and the blades and the patriarch, and all the things that get told and retold now like they were inevitable. It was a Tuesday, I think. Station Standard Tuesday. The lighting sequence shifted slightly on Tuesdays, a quality-of-life implementation that I always thought was slightly worse than no quality-of-life implementation at all. Early morning. I was going past the Eastern Wing access corridor because I had started going past it out of habit, not really meaning to stop. I stopped. Through the panel in the ordinary enclosure lighting, in the ordinary quiet of a nothing morning, Catera, sitting cross-legged on the enclosure floor, reading from her paper book. 7 cubs in various states of sprawl around her. Patches had his head on her ankle. Sen was watching the page as if she could read it. Carr was technically asleep, but had arranged himself so that one of his enormous forelimbs was in contact with her left side, which I had learned by then was his way of insisting on something without admitting to it. She was reading, they were listening. Whatever story it was going into the room and settling there, and nobody in that room was anywhere else. I stood there for a few minutes. Then I went to the commissary. My food was cold again, I didn't mind. Filed by Archivist Senneth Voller, Coalition Historical Preservation Unit. This account was assembled over 4 years from the sources listed herein. Corporal, now Division Liaison Catera Moslin reviewed a summary of the compiled materials and offered no corrections. She noted in her review response, You got most of it right. You can tell them I was more scared than any of it sounds. That's true, and I think it matters. We are telling them. The 7 cubs Car, Sen, Dun, Rill, Moth, 7 and Patches are all confirmed living as of the date of this compilation. Car and Sen have both reached full adult stature and are active in their respective hunting parties. Dun, the researchers note, has been described by Vrek observers as unusually gentle for his size, which some consider remarkable, and which those of us who read Corporal Osula's logs consider not remarkable at all. The blades continue to carry the mark. As of this archive's publication date, the practice has spread beyond Grun Veth's original hunting force. Coalition xenocultural observers have now documented the inscription on blades belonging to Vrek warriors from 14 separate clan structures, most of whom have no direct connection to the Dun Station incident. When asked about this, one Vrek warrior, young, newly bladed, no connection to the original events, said through his translator, "We carry the mark because we want our blades to know what they are for, not for killing, for standing at the last door. We want them to know that is possible, that a being has done it, that it can be done." He paused, his translator waited. He added, "We want to remember that someone showed us what the last door looks like, and that she was still standing in front of it when we arrived.